Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes to allow everyone to join us. People are still coming into the waiting room, so bear with us a second and we'll start in just a couple of minutes. Okay, thanks very much for being patient. We will make a start. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us and showing interest in this really important issue. I'll introduce myself first. I'm Dr. Sam Lucy, Director of Admissions for the Cambridge Colleges, but this session is really the result of work by Esme Page at Newnham and Amber Cuttle at Pembroke, who have involved a number of us in discussions about issues surrounding refugee education. So I'm delighted that today we've got some speakers from Refugee Education UK who've agreed to come along and give us an introduction to this topic, because it's certainly not something I know the intricacies of, and I suspect that's true for a number of us as well. And so first up, we've got Kate Barringer, who is Head of Educational Progression at Refugee Education UK, and she's going to spend about 15 minutes talking about the barriers to accessing higher education in the UK for forced migrants. We're then going to turn to Dan Webb, who is the Higher Education Project Coordinator, who actually supports young people getting offers from higher education, and he's going to talk about some of the solutions. So we're not just going to give you problems, we're also going to give you ideas that can help as well. And then I'm really pleased, we've got Shahani, who is a medic at Plymouth, and she's going to engage in a sort of 5-minute Q&A with Dan, talking around her progress into higher education in the UK as well. And we are going to then have hopefully about 15-20 minutes worth of Q&A session. We will finish by 3 o'clock though, because I have to be somewhere else at 3, and I'm sure a number of other people do as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn over to Katie and hand over to her to introduce us to this really interesting area.
Oh, thank you so much, Sam, for that introduction. And thank you for inviting us to speak to you today. It's a real privilege, and I think I speak for myself and Dan and Shahani to say we are encouraged and excited to see so many people here. So my colleague Dan and I work for an organisation called Refugee Education UK, and we work with young refugees and asylum seekers aged 14 to 25 to help them access, progress and thrive in education through a number of different programmes. We also conduct research both in the UK and internationally, and we run training for education institutions, local authorities, NGOs. The programme that Dan and I work on specifically is the Educational Progression Programme, and there are 2 strands to this, an Access to Further Education project, and then the Access to Higher Education project that we're here to speak about today. So before I start, a slight disclaimer about terminology. Throughout this talk, I'm going to be referring to forced migrants, which is a rather clunky catch-all term to describe young people with a variety of different immigration statuses and experiences. So without further ado, let's look at some of those barriers that prevent access and progression for forced migrant students. I've grouped these barriers into 4 categories. There are structural barriers, contextual barriers, financial barriers, and what we're calling everyday barriers, but with the huge caveat that there's considerable overlap between the categories, and quite a few things might have gone in 2 categories. So the first structural barrier that young refugees navigate is the hostile environment policy initiated by Theresa May when she was Home Secretary. So this led to an increase in wariness towards immigrants in general, and particularly placed the responsibility to check immigration status on institutions, organisations, and even individuals such as landlords. And this need to constantly prove their immigration status has undoubtedly made life more stressful and more complex for those from forced migration backgrounds. Another consequence is that forced migrants are sometimes not given what they're actually entitled to by overly risk-averse organisations or individuals. And we unfortunately do see this quite a bit from universities. But even without the hostile environment policy, the systems that forced migrants have to operate within are already exceptionally complicated. They must navigate the complexities of our labyrinthine immigration system. Then there's the education system, which for many will include routes through FE as well as school. They may also be in the care and welfare system, whether that's through receiving mainstream benefits or because they're receiving specific Home Office destitution support. And then finally, if they come to this country as a minor and without family, they will also be under the care of the local authority. And it's not just the systems which are complex, but also the processes connected to each system are convoluted and time-consuming. So let's start with the immigration system. A young forced migrant will need to attend regular appointments with their lawyer and with the Home Office or at an immigration tribunal. And these are most likely to be scheduled for school or college time, which will then impact on their attendance. They may additionally have reporting requirements where they're expected to sign in at a Home Office building on a regular basis, whether that's monthly or bi-weekly. And this can sometimes be as far away as Liverpool for young people living in the south of England. They're under constant threat of potentially being detained in an immigration facility or receiving something known as a study ban. What's more, if they're destitute, which the majority of forced migrants are, because remember, they're not allowed to work until their immigration status is regularised. They must live where the Home Office dictates and will regularly be moved in the middle of an academic year. Now, you may think this all sounds very difficult, but it's a quick process after which they will have their immigration status regularised and everything will get much easier. In reality, the Home Office sometimes takes years to make a decision, and these delays have only been exacerbated by COVID. So as an example, we're working with one young girl who's at university at the moment on a sanctuary scholarship, who's been waiting 7 years for the outcome of her immigration application. And on top of all of this, there is a dearth of good legal representation. And so forced migrants often have to try and find their own solicitors. All of this takes time, money, and particularly emotional bandwidth. As I mentioned, a lot of forced migrants will arrive in the UK in their mid-teens without any family and will therefore be looked after the local authorities and go in the UK care system. Universities recognise multiple disadvantages connected with UK care experience students, and many universities will respond with specific contextual admission policies. But for students from a forced migration background, this is just one of the complex systems they will be navigating, and all of this usually not in their first language. For those who do come to the UK with their families, they will almost certainly either be in receipt of mainstream benefits or specific Home Office financial support, known as NAS support. And again, these are complex systems to navigate. If you are in receipt of mainstream benefits, such as universal credit, you're not allowed to study full time, so that will further delay what is already a very interrupted education. Home Office support essentially involves continually proving destitution and essentially condemns you to living on £38 a week in substandard accommodation in a deprived part of the UK. As I've already mentioned, you're likely to have no control over when or where you move, and it's extremely likely that any forced migrant that you interacted with will have had to move house multiple times. We've seen it happen time and time again with our casework, that a young forced migrant is finally enrolled in a college and a course that they wish to study, and is then moved mid-year to another part of the country where, best case scenario, they wait a year and re-enroll in the same course. But worst case scenario, and this is often what happens, is that that delay has caused them to be over 19, therefore they're no longer eligible for free funding, or they've maybe moved to a part of the country where there are fewer FE colleges and the course they wish to study is not available to them. Which leads us onto the education system, the final system that an academically minded forced migrant must engage with. our education system, for understandable and proper reasons, is designed for students to enter early and progress through smoothly, and assumes a proficiency in English language. Now, we could do a whole talk on just the education system, but I think key points for a university such as Cambridge looking for academic excellence to bear in mind are, firstly, that the majority of forced migrants will have gaps in their education caused by fleeing conflict or persecution. And the consequence of that is that many students will be significantly older than their UK contemporaries. And the consequence of this is that many forced migrant students will turn 19 and not yet have completed the UK qualifications required to apply for university. And the problem with turning 19 is that funding suddenly becomes an issue, as well as the qualifications on offer. The second point is that A-level courses are extremely difficult to get onto if you're over 18. And so many students from a forced migration background will do BTECs or access courses. And I think the point that we really want to emphasize here is that is not because they're not clever enough to do A-levels, but it's because that option was not open to them. The system also has little to offer students who are academically gifted and often have high subject knowledge, but need intensive English language support. So ESOL, so that's English for speakers of other language, is something that FE colleges typically run. And it's a one-size-fits-all solution. There are very large classes, extremely limited hours a week, and a huge mix of ability. So in the same class, you are likely to have someone who is barely literate in their mother tongue, with another student who previously was top of their class and university ready in their home country. And this is something that the students we work with find incredibly frustrating. So moving on to contextual barriers. I think the first of these would be the difficulty that young forced migrants have in proving their previous qualifications. So there's NARIC, which I imagine you're all familiar with, but bear in mind that the fee for this is £60. So that equates to almost 2 weeks living costs for someone in home office accommodation. And NARIC, or ENIC, as I think it's now called, is dependent on having certificates or reasonable copies of certificates of qualifications from a home country. Now, clearly that grabbing your certificates is not usually a priority for people fleeing persecution. And it's often impossibly risky once young people are in the UK. And very tragically, we do actually know of one young man we work with who was so keen to go to college and needed his certificates, and he sent a family member back to his home village, and that family member was killed trying to get the school leaving certificates for this young man. The next point would be English language requirements. So if a forced migrant has not done GCSEs in their country, they're usually expected to take an IELTS test. Now, we at RE UK believe there's an over-reliance on IELTS, and we do wonder if this has bled over from the Tier 4 compliance required for international students. In reality, for the young people we work with, IELTS becomes another barrier. It's very expensive, and it usually requires tuition or preparatory study, which again comes with a cost. And then, of course, there is the application process for university, UCAS, another fee, albeit relatively small, that young people who are having to constantly prove destitution are expected to pay. Many of these young people are not necessarily in schools or colleges that offer the support with this process that many UK students will enjoy. And almost none of them will have parents that have the level of English or understanding of the application process to support their children. Additionally, if the student's immigration status means that they're not eligible for student finance, at the same time as doing UCAS, they'll have to be thinking about scholarship applications. And then, of course, there's mental health difficulties. And again, this is something we could do a sort of whole talk in, but I think suffice to say that it's unusual for a student from this background not to have some level of mental health difficulties. So PTSD, depression, insomnia, anxiety are all very, very typical for the young people that we interact with. So the third sort of group of barriers is financial barriers. And I think hopefully by now you'll have picked up that financial barriers are woven into almost every other barrier. The reality is that most students from forced migration backgrounds will be living in relative poverty. To reiterate that asylum seekers are not allowed to work, and those relying on Home Office destitution support will be living on £38 a week. so much of what we've talked about under contextual and structural barriers has a fee attached. UCAS, IELTS, post-19 study is quite often not fee free. Additionally, many students will struggle with things like transport fees to college or school and books or other resources. And then, of course, if a student does manage to get a place at university, then there's the whole issue of fee status and tuition fees. Whether a student is classified as a home or overseas student is entirely dependent on their immigration status. And asylum-seeking students will be classified as overseas students and will not be eligible for student finance. Even if an asylum-seeking student does manage to get one of the very few scholarships available, their overseas classification, which can't be changed, often means that they're not eligible to receive university hardship funds. And then the final group of barriers that I want to talk about are what we call everyday barriers. And it's sad, but undoubtedly true that racism and prejudice plays out in the everyday experience of these young people. Too many times we've seen eligible young people turned away, particularly from FE colleges. And quite often this is not by the teachers, but by frontline reception staff or even security guards. We've also come across other students who have been told to enroll on ESOL courses, despite English being their mother tongue, and we can think of no other reason for that than they speak with heavily accented English. Then there's the issue of incorrect advice and guidance. And actually, we do really understand this, given the complexities of the systems and processes, which I have very quickly touched the surface of. It's really unsurprising that many practitioners don't understand the rights and entitlements of forced migrants to education. And our experience working with these young people, which is supported by research we conducted for UNICEF last year, is that this lack of support coupled with incorrect advice are two of the greatest barriers to educational progression for young forced migrants. And then the final everyday barrier is this issue of documentation. So if you remember going back to where I started this, talking about the risk-averse culture, many colleges are extremely strict about the types of documentation needed to enroll or to produce to have a fee waiver. The trouble with that is that the Home Office is very, very slow to issue this documentation, and again has become even slower due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so many forced migrants simply do not have the documentation that colleges are expecting them to produce, which then delays what is already a hugely delayed educational journey. So this all sounds very, very glum, and in many cases is, but I think before I hand over to my colleague Dan to speak to you about some of the things that we can do to change this, I just want to end on a more positive note. So I'm speaking as someone who, when I did my A-levels, my mother cooked my meals, washed my clothes, did everything for me. And I look back and I realize how cosseted I was. And you might think that with all the barriers I've talked about, that young people might just give up, but they don't. The young people we work with are so passionate about education, and they really do see it as a bridge out of what is quite often an extremely traumatic past and a very uncertain present. They see it, and I might say actually more than I've seen UK students see it, they see it as a bridge into a future that can be different. They are, quite frankly, the most resilient and extraordinary young people I've ever worked with. So now I'm going to hand over to Dan to tell you a little bit more about our ideas about how it can be different.
Thanks very much, Katie. So obviously, having given Katie the unenviable task of that whistle-stop tour through the multiple barriers and challenges, I'm just going to touch on a few ideas that we can all do to widen access to university for young people from forced migration backgrounds. I'm going to throw out a number of ideas. Two are going to be quite big ideas, a few medium-sized ideas, and then a couple of small ones to end. And some of these ideas, I'm sure you're probably already implementing, so apologies if I'm preaching to the choir here. So with all those kind of barriers and challenges in mind, let's jump in with two big ideas to widen access. Katie's already touched on these a little bit, but one of the best ways to widen access to university for forced migrants is to create scholarships specifically for those type of students to give them access. And ideally, you want to have full scholarships that cover both a student's tuition fees and living costs, mainly because most of these students have no access to student finance because of their immigration status. So in the UK at the moment, I think there's about 80 universities who have specific scholarships for forced migration background students. And this equates at the moment to about 250 to 300 scholarships, maybe a bit more. Most of these scholarships are called either Article 26 scholarships or sanctuary scholarships. And it's pretty simple. They give life-changing opportunities to forced migrants who just wouldn't be able to afford to go to university otherwise. And so I know at Cambridge at the moment, you have the Rowan Williams Scholarship, which from my reading of it, is probably pretty similar to an Article 26 or sanctuary scholarship. And that's absolutely fantastic that you have that scholarship. But I wonder, I'm going to be a bit cheeky here, I wonder if there's potential for Cambridge to do a little bit more, not only in terms of the number of those scholarships you give each year, but also practically speaking, in maybe trying to bring the Rowan Williams Scholarship more in line with some of the existing Article 26 and sanctuary scholarships. And what I mean by that is that Article 26 and the University of Sanctuary movement have, through the past few years, come up with some brilliant advice for best practice for administering scholarships for forced migrants. You know, from how you advertise best, how you create an application process that's sensitive to those students' needs, what you should ask and what you shouldn't ask, how you select successful scholars, and then how you support those scholars through a program of study. And all of that kind of best practice is informed by that kind of central notion that we don't want these scholarships or applying to these scholarships to be another barrier for these individuals to have to overcome. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that it would be kind of interesting to measure up how the Rowan Williams Scholarship measures up against these existing scholarships as well. So that's my number one big idea: create more scholarships that are sensitive to the needs of individuals from forced migration backgrounds. Number two big idea, we could charge asylum seekers and those with precarious immigration statuses home fees. So I know what Katie talked about earlier. We know that asylum seekers and others with precarious statuses will always legally be classified as international or overseas students. But we also know that universities can exercise discretion and choose to charge them home fees. And I think at the moment, there's a small but growing number, probably around 10 or 11 universities in the UK who are already doing this. So if you charge a forced migration background student home fees, that won't make them eligible for student finance, and they won't be eligible for your kind of hardship grants. But what it will do is make potentially a small number of asylum seekers who can afford home fees the chance to go to university. Now, I have to admit, I'm not actually sure how that kind of practically works in terms of how a university sorts out internally. I guess it would differ from university to university, but we know it's possible because there's already universities doing it. And the other thing that this would do, if you charge asylum seekers home fees, it's a huge symbolic statement about how we see and how we value these individuals. That we're saying that these asylum seekers are not just another type of international student. They're different. They're people who have come to the UK seeking protection, and they should have access to university on merit. So if a university like Cambridge was to exercise its discretion and charge asylum seekers home fees, it would mobilize massive symbolic capital, and it would be a huge deal, and potentially other universities would follow suit. So they're my kind of two big ideas: scholarship and home fees. So on to my medium-sized ideas, and I'm going to go through these ones quite fast, so we can talk about them in the question and answer session afterwards if you want. But they're all going to be about creating access pathways into Cambridge for these students. So here's a few ideas. You could run specific outreach events or special open days, especially for these type of students, because where it gives them a bit more space to ask some of the questions that are going to be pertinent to them. And these are going to be questions that are going to be pretty different from the questions that a UK student is going to ask you on an open day. And, you know, feel free to invite us or other organisations to these open days or outreach events, because we'd be more than happy to help you help these young people into Cambridge. So my first idea. Second one, think of creative ways to assess an applicant's English language capabilities. So as Katie chatted before, there's an over-reliance on IELTS at the moment, but there's other English language tests out there that are often offered free for forced migrants. So maybe that's a creative way. I'm sure there's lots of other creative ideas that people could come up with for assessing their English language capabilities when they're applying. Third idea, I think it'd be amazing if every university had a named and trained contact person, probably like you already do for kind of UK care leavers, who would be able to kind of respond sensitively to queries from prospective students who are from these backgrounds. And this person could also be kind of a focal point to help and support current students that you might have at university who are also from these backgrounds. And I think that's going to be really important for your foundation year, which I'll talk about a little bit in a second, because the problems that Katie discussed in the first section don't stop when these students get into university. They often come out of the blue and are sideswiped by complex student problems that your UK students just will never face. And they're often problems that no one can ever prepare for. And so you need a trained member of staff who can help students negotiate these problems. So I'm talking about stuff like, what happens if an asylum seeker who's at your university, what happens if their claim is suddenly rejected and they become appeal rights exhausted? Or what happens if the Home Office detains them or gives them a study ban or deports them? Like, having a trained member of staff to help a student negotiate those kind of level of problems would be a huge thing. My next medium-sized idea is about making your contextual admissions process. I think you guys have like an extenuating circumstance form process, making that as clear and as accessible as possible. I imagine that some applicants from forced migration backgrounds may not even know that that process of disclosing extenuating circumstances exists. And if they are aware of it, they might actually feel pretty uneasy about disclosing either their immigration status or their immigration problems and their extenuating circumstances. And that's kind of understandable given the wider hostile environment that they're having to negotiate. So making your extenuating circumstance process as clear as possible. My last medium-sized idea is a bit of a speculative and probably a bit of a cheeky one, but I kind of feel like if you don't ask, then you don't get. And in light of the fact that many young people, as Katie talked about, have no choice about the educational pathway that they're shoehorned into because they come when they're older, I wonder if Cambridge would consider accepting non-traditional qualifications from FE pathways, like, for example, BTEC level 3s. Now, I know there is an argument to say that individuals who might have taken a BTEC course at an FE college might not cope on a Cambridge degree programme. And for some, that would be the case. That's absolutely true. But for others, because of what they've been through in their lives, they'll be like the most resilient, hardworking, determined, and resourceful students you'll ever meet. And that's exactly the type of student I think Cambridge is probably looking for. So I work with a number of young people who are intellectually brilliant, but they're doing a BTEC level 3 course through no choice of their own. If they could do A levels, they would have, but they had no choice. And if you don't accept a BTEC qualification as a pathway into Cambridge, you're going to miss out on these students because they will end up going to a university that does have a contextual admissions policy that's sensitive to forced migration, and that will accept their BTEC qualification. So I'm wondering if there's like a creative way that you could find of assessing forced migrants who are taking BTEC courses, just to see if actually they would be able to cope on a Cambridge course. So I know you're going to start a foundation course from September, and this is exactly one of the ways that you're thinking through creating pathways into Cambridge from young people who haven't gone down those traditional A-level pathways. And I just want to say that's brilliant. I've read some of the information. It's amazing. We're genuinely over the moon that this program's starting, and we're going to be referring a lot of our young people to apply for this program. So if that creates extra work for you, and we would love to chat to the team who are going to be running this foundation program, because I suspect that they're going to be at the sharp end of some of the problems that we've been talking about, and some of the problems that come out of the blue that will affect some of the students on your foundation course. And we'd love to help in any way we can to smooth their progress through that foundation year. So they're kind of my quick, medium-sized ideas. Here's my small ideas that are going to be really easy to implement. First one, we're kind of doing it now, continually training your frontline staff in the barriers and challenges and the rights and entitlements of students from forced migration backgrounds. And so this is going to be especially staff members who are going to be coming into direct communication with young people from these backgrounds. So admission staff, widening access, welfare. And we're basically doing that now. So you can tick that one off the list. But with the caveat that the barriers that these young people face and the rights and entitlements that they have are always changing according to the Home Office changing their rules. So it's going to be a continual process of learning and retraining whenever possible. So that's my first small idea. My second small idea, and possibly the most important one out of all the ideas I'm going to talk about. So if you don't remember anything I've said, remember this one, is that the tone and the manner in which you communicate with young people from forced migration backgrounds is the most important thing to get right. So I know from my experience in running our advice service at Refugee Education, getting an email from a young person who has a complex immigration situation, whose English is potentially pretty ropey, and who might not have any idea of the right way of how the system is meant to work, it can be pretty frustrating and pretty time consuming to have to respond to them. And they might come back with questions. And I know for myself, and I'm pretty grumpy, so I'm sure you're not like me, it can be pretty easy to be a little bit dismissive, or just to write them a short email, or, you know, not to go out of your way to help them too much. But I don't want to trade on the trauma that these young people face too much. But they've been through situations that we can't possibly imagine. And they're probably still living in and with circumstances that are absolutely awful. And so if you remember nothing else, if you come into contact with a student who discloses that they're from a forced migration background, so they're an asylum seeker refugee, just take your time and be as welcoming as you possibly can with how you communicate with them. Even if you have to give them bad news, so you have to tell them they're not eligible to apply to Cambridge, or they haven't got a scholarship, even if it's bad news, be kind and patient and be helpful, and signpost them in ways which means that they can move forward in their education, because for most of these guys, education is the key thing that they cling on to. So they're my two small ideas. We'll probably post a link in the chat at some point to some research we did for UNICEF, which has all of these ideas for universities in one kind of helpful fact sheet. So Katie, if you have that link, I can post it in the chat later. But now I wanted to introduce one of the students that I have the absolute honor of working with at the moment, Shahani, who, well, I'll get her to introduce herself and what she's doing. Shahani, are you there?
I am here. Hello, everyone. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you great. So Shahani, I wondered if you could just introduce yourself and maybe just say what you're doing, what you're studying.
So I am a medical student studying at the University of Plymouth.
Perfect. And so I hope you don't mind me sharing, but Shahani, you are from a forced migration background. And so I was wondering, with that in mind, if you could kind of share some of the challenges that you faced when you were trying to access university, and also maybe some of the challenges you faced whilst you have been at university, and maybe just talk about how they've made you kind of feel.
Yeah, definitely. So my journey into higher education / university has not been easy. So I have been going through the asylum process for over 14 years. Still going through it now. So I completed my A-levels back in 2014. And obviously when you're an asylum seeker, you're not eligible for student finance. You're classed as an international student. So I was not able to attend university. And so that was a bit of a setback. And for 4 to 5 years, I was at home. And then in 2019, I was granted 2.5 years of leave on the basis that I've been living in the UK for over half of my life. So I thought, great, finally I have my leave to remain. So this means I can start applying for university. And so I did. And I got offers from lots of medical schools. And then I soon found out that, okay, despite living in the UK for over half my life and also having the 2.5 year leave, I was still not eligible for student finance, and the university still classed me as an international student. So that was really frustrating. And as most of you know, getting into medical school or getting into university is not easy. So I was thinking, okay, this is like my dreams destroyed. But I didn't give up. I thought, okay, let me just look for scholarships. And so I did. And I found out that scholarships are not easy to get. They're very, very competitive. People wait years to even get a chance, and only a couple of people per year get scholarships. And also scholarships for medicine is even more competitive. But that didn't set me back. I applied to lots of scholarships. I didn't get most of them, but one scholarship got back to me, and I got through an interview, and I got offered this scholarship called the Westheimer Scholarship. So they are now paying for my tuition fees and also my living costs. So that's great. But obviously getting through that process was hard because I had to convince the university to class me as a home student. And that was a very stressful, long battle. Had to explain myself, provide lots of proof that I've been here for a number of years. And I felt like many of the admissions team didn't really understand my status or what the asylum process was or anything like that. So having to explain all that over and over again was really frustrating. But we got through it. So that was another barrier. And so I started university in last year. Everything was going fine, really smooth. And then my mom was granted refugee status just a couple of months back. We were living in home office accommodation. As Katie said, it's called NAS accommodation. But once you get leave to remain, obviously you have to vacate the home office premises, and you only get 28 days. So mom was told that mom's eligible to get a council house, but I was not. So that meant that I was at risk of being homeless. So I messaged Dan, and I said, this is my situation. Is there anything you can do to help me? And my scholarship organization, they came to my rescue. They were his savior. But without them, I would have nowhere to be. I'd have no home. So now I have a little studio flat that I stay in, and I can obviously continue my studies there. So yeah, it's just been a very stressful process. And when you think it's coming to an end, it's not. It's always just an ongoing problem. So yeah.
Thanks, Shahani. Thanks for sharing some of that. Goes without saying that Shahani is one of the most brilliant, resilient students I've ever worked with. But like she says, the problems just can come out of nowhere, can't they? So I just wondered, maybe to end, whether you had one piece of advice for all these lovely people from Cambridge. If you could just give them one piece of advice, what would you say to them for when they come across students from forced migration backgrounds?
Educate yourself on the issues and barriers that people like us face. so that we feel more comfortable to open up and share our problems and seek help, because that's really important. And also just be really kind and understanding, because that also helps.
Thanks, Shahani. That's amazing. I mean, you all look like kind and understanding people, so I'm sure that's not too much sure. I think that's the end of our section. I don't know if we're moving into a Q&A time now.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, all three of you. I have to say that's three of the clearest presentations I've heard in a long time. So thank you enormously for that. We'll certainly take a look at the thing that you put in the link, because obviously we do update all of our training materials each year. So that's the kind of thing that we could really easily incorporate into our handbooks that admission staff refer to all the time. And we'll definitely take some of your points forward. There is a small group of us working on this, and for everybody's information, we are thinking about whether we can work with the university and apply for University of Sanctuary status, so combining it with some of the work on the scholarships and actually get that formal accreditation. But at this stage, I would like to open it up for questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, if you can use your electronic hand, I will then see it on my screen. But if you don't want to ask it in front of lots of people, you can also put it in the chat, which I can see, and I'll ask it for you. So can I start off by inviting questions from anyone in particular? Everyone needs to find their electronic hand, which is under reactions these days. I mean, I have one question, which is, at what point do any forced migrant background students become eligible for student finance? Is it the granting of indefinite leave to remain or the granting of refugee status, for example?
I mean, I'll take that one. It is dependent on immigration status. So somebody who had refugee status would be. Another status called humanitarian protection, which is similar to refugee status, would also mean that you were a home student and eligible for student finance. It then becomes a little bit more complicated with, Shahani mentioned limited leave to remain, and that's the really complex one, because it depends on the length of time you've been in the UK, whether or not you are eligible. So asylum seekers, definitely not. And they are the sort of largest group of students, I think, that find themselves in these really difficult situations. And as I mentioned earlier, that being in the asylum process can be something that goes on for years and years and years. Refugee and humanitarian protection, you're fine in terms of home fee status. And then there are a few other statuses that are kind of more complex, and you have to do it on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you. Does anyone...
I was just going to add to that as well. I mean, even when someone gets refugee status, when their asylum claim has been resolved and they should become eligible for student finance, it can still be such a complex process in that I'm working with a young person at the moment who has refugee status, should have access to student finance, but the Home Office sent him a biometric residence permit, which is an ID card with the wrong birth date on, and that's exactly the type of evidence that student finance want. And the Home Office are notoriously bad at correcting their mistakes or admitting their mistakes, and so he's completely stuck in that he can't prove his residency status, and he's waiting on the Home Office. So even when people get status that's regularized, it can still be an incredibly difficult journey to getting student finance.
Absolutely.
So one of the things we can do as an institution is actually go straight to student finance. We have relationship managers at student finance who can often iron these things out at a higher level, which is always everybody worth knowing, I think. Sorry, Katie, you were going to say something.
And I was just going to say that it's the problems are sometimes within the Home Office, but actually student finance itself is not necessarily as up to date on the guidance as you might hope. So, for example, humanitarian protection, the rules have changed relatively recently, and we and other organisations that work with forced migrants still regularly come across young people with HP who are being told by student finance that they're not eligible when actually they are. So just what Dan was saying, really, that nothing's ever simple. Even when it should be simple, it's simple, and when it's not supposed to be simple, it's incredibly complicated.
Thank you. So there's a question from Isha. Have you at Refugee Education UK helped to run any outreach events with universities before? And is there anything in particular that you'd recommend including, or anything that should be considered when planning one?
I'm waiting for Dan to pick that one up, but I will if you want.
The short answer is no. We've never actually been involved in helping universities, but I think we'd definitely be open to doing that. Although there are, Katie might be annoyed at me for saying this, there are other organisations who are possibly better placed, like STAR and the University of Sanctuary movement, probably have more experience than us in helping universities to run outreach events. I think we're more focused on kind of frontline direct work with young people. But I mean, we'd be very happy to sit in on any discussions if you were planning to do an outreach event, but we're also very happy to signpost you to other people who probably already have that experience. Is that okay, Katie? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I would absolutely agree with that.
Thank you. I think Esme's got a question.
I've got a question about English language. You mentioned free English language qualifications earlier. So we are a trusted institution, so we can assess English language ourselves and not have to set an IELTS requirement. But if we did, if we were in a situation where we didn't feel reassured by someone's English language and we did want to set a qualification, and if we want to look into the free English language qualifications and whether we would feel that they were suitable, have you got any examples of what those might be?
Yeah, definitely. I can send you some details of the two. One's called Password. I don't know if you've ever heard of Password. And I think more recently, Duolingo has set up some kind of qualification. So they're the two that come to mind. And I know that there's quite a lot of universities that will accept those qualifications now. But most importantly, it's free for the young person to take whatever test they do. Whereas obviously with IELTS, it's not. And through COVID, the IELTS Centre, a lot of them closed, and it's just been a really difficult year in terms of English language requirements. So yeah, let me send you the details, but Password and Duolingo are the two that come to mind.
Okay, awesome, thank you.
I've got another question from Frankie. Are there any routes potentially externally, and quite often colleges and other institutions have professional training budgets that they can use for training courses? So basically, are there any training courses that are offered that can help staff educate themselves about these sorts of issues?
Yeah, we run training, so we run access to higher education training. We do a lot of training of universities that are going for sort of University of Sanctuary status, so that would be in-house training, but then we also run this training every other month, and that's where individuals can sign themselves up, and that one has the advantage of a much more mixed group, so you'll be there with social workers and teachers from colleges and other NGOs, which has its own flavour, but as well as us, there are other organisations that run great training as well. So there's another organisation called We Belong that does training which is more aimed at young people with limited leave to remain. They've got a real specialism in that. So we can definitely link you up with any training that you might wish.
Thank you. And a slightly related question. If we as a university have contact with forced migrant background students who are looking for help, is there a referral process direct to you that we can use?
Yeah, so we have a national advice service that would be very happy to send you the details of that. Young people can get in contact with us. At the moment, it's using email and WhatsApp for live chat, but also practitioners can ask questions. So if anyone here ever has something that they want to ask, we can drop our advice line contact details maybe in the chat, Katie, and feel free to email us. I say it's the national advice. It's basically myself and my colleague George who run it, and we have so many people come through, especially at busy times of the year. So it might take a couple of days to get a response, but honestly, feel free anytime, no matter how silly you think the question might be, we'd love to be able to help out in whatever way we can.
Thank you. There's a question from Carol. Shahani mentioned the change to her parents' dating status resulting in their rights as refugees, but not necessarily for her. And that's presumably age related. So can you give us a sense of what the rules are around age and status based on accompanied children?
I think the constraints of time mean that I will not be able to answer that question even if I had an hour. And also with the Home Office, it doesn't feel like there's much rhyme or reason to some decisions they make. So whilst sometimes siblings can get different status decisions, even though they're a couple of years apart, parents and children can get different status. It's just not unusual. And I'm not a legal immigration expert, so I'm not sure exactly why those decisions are made. I don't know if the Home Office know why they make those decisions, but it's just not uncommon for that to happen. I'm guessing it was an age-related thing in Shahani's case, but I don't want to speak for Shahani. Shahani, do you want to talk about your case? You don't have to.
So what happened was when the caseworker who was looking at mom's file a couple of months ago didn't realize that mom had 2 children. So obviously they didn't read her case properly. And they ended up just granting mom. And then when our solicitor followed it up, they said it's a bit too late now. So that the Home Office wants me and my brother to put a fresh asylum claim in our own right to be considered all over again. So yeah, that's just how it is. When the Home Office makes a decision, they don't really like to go back and undo their mistakes.
Okay, thank you, and sympathies for you. Okay, are there any further questions from anyone? Do stick them in the chat or stick your hand up if there is anything else you want to ask. But otherwise, I think the next steps for us are to collate all of this really useful information. So there's clearly different sets of information that are going to be useful, particularly for admissions officers in the Central Admissions Office. And we'll put those into a sensible place and let people know that they're there. And then I think within the university itself, we'll take forward these plans to see if we can get ourselves as an accredited institution. I will definitely take on board the funding issues. There is a discussion at very high levels about different categories of unfunded students, and this would be another of them. So we're going to take that forward as well. But otherwise, I think we'll wrap up. And a huge thank you to Dan, Katie and Shahani for coming along and really just giving such a clear and concise and actually quite moving account of all the difficulties that you face. So thank you very much from all of us here at Cambridge.
We've loved it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for having us. Thank you.
Like I said at the beginning, we're really pleased to see so many of you. So thank you for taking time out of your, I'm sure, very busy days.
Okay, thank you, everybody.